There are many different theories amongst the scholars of the old world regarding the origins of the NORSCANs. Some aver that the Norse are the descendants of demons, a race of bloodthirsty monsters whose very existence is at odds with the natural order, while others argue that they are a race of giants and kin to the hulking denizens of the ogre kingdoms. Yet others submit that the Norsemen are supernatural creatures of ice and snow, born of the merciless winds of winter. In truth, the ethnogenesis of the NORSCANs begins with their ancient ancestors, the NORSII, an ancient tribe of barbarians who had long venerated the chaos gods, particularly the blood god Karneth. Ancient sagas record that during the cataclysmic events of the fall of the Old Ones, when chaos first burst forth into the world, that tribes of primitive humans made common cause with the demonic hordes, creating unholy pacts with chaos's dark lords and binding their people to their worship. Thus were born the first of the warriors of chaos, and the NORSII were among those first tribes to pledge their souls to chaos, alongside the ancestors of the Kurgan and Hung. Riding as the vanguard of the chaos hordes, these barbarous mortal tribes brought ruin and devastation upon the gleaming kingdoms of dwarf and elf, and so were the mighty bastions of order humbled by their brutal onslaught, and untold millions were slain. The much later records of the Norscan dwarf clans, most significant being the Chronicle of Dread Yngvar Jorvarsson, make mention of several specific tribes of warlike humans far outstripping the imperial tribes in their savagery and bellicosity, migrating and settling in the northernmost parts of the old world. These being the lands later to become Kislev, Nordland, and Ostland. Most significant among these groups were the horse-bound Ungols, the grim Fry Kings, the Thor-worshipping Ropsmen, and, most notably, the savage blood-bound NORSII tribes, such as the brutal warriors of the ferocious Iron Wolves clan, and others besides. The migration of the northern tribes is dated reliably in the Norse Dwarf Chronicles as having taken place in -1012 IC, putting it roughly 20 years prior to the later Blackfire Pass migration of the Hunbarokin, Teutokin, Merokin, and other imperial precursors. The NORSII settle in their new homelands, raiding and pillaging their neighbours for additional resources and to catch the eyes of their malefic deities. Imperial legends from before the age of Sigmar narrate how, having been pushed to their limits by the conquest of the NORSII, the southerly tribes had banded together into a great host to push the NORSII to the utmost northern lands of the Reich Bassin, confining the brutal raiders to the lands above the Middle Mountains for centuries. Other NORSII clans were driven yet further back to the Chaos Wastes themselves, where they were believed by the southern tribes to have perished. This was not the case, however, and it was in these unholy lands that the NORSII were able to indulge themselves more freely in the gifts of the Chaos Gods, and connect themselves more deeply with the darkest aspects of their violent beliefs. These black-armored marauders would return to their kinfolk in black proud longships, rising to lead their kinsmen in warfare. As one of the earliest tribes to settle the Reich Bassin, the NORSCI may have also participated in the massacre of peaceful agriculturist tribes that had settled the area previously, likely alongside the Ropsmen and the Teutogens. The NORSCI are also known to have contended mightily with the Theodosies, having raided and despoiled the lands of their enemies on countless occasions. In 9 IC, the NORSCI under High King CORMAC BLOODAXE assaulted the Theodosies' capital city and slew King Volfilla and his entire family, crucifying their bodies upon the walls of their own palace. Barbarous and warlike, even beyond that of the Teutogen or the Ungauls, the NORSCI were ever the bane of their southerly neighbours, despised and feared for their brutality and consummate skill at warfare. It was only under the rule of SIGMAR HELDENHAMMER that the ferocious sea wolves of the Norsemen were held at bay, and finally driven from the Empire to their bleak homeland in the Chaos Wastes. As the chosen race of the ruinous powers, the Norsemen had seen it as their right and duty to butcher and plunder the tribes of the south, laying low all who dared to oppose them, virtually unchallenged until the rise of blessed Sigmar. Pleased by the ferocity of their servants, the dark gods bestowed the NORSCI with the blessings of chaos, increasing their indomitable might and making them as wolves amongst sheep. Forever on the fringes of the southern lands, the NORSCI became a fearsome race of skilled fighters, and many vicegerents of the dark gods had served as advisors to the northern clans, guiding and shaping their destinies, preparing the NORSCI for their role as the harbingers of the end times. The depredations of the NORSCI are described in grandiose terms by the legends of the Age of Sigmar, speaking of hulking Norsemen bedecked in heavy black plate, wielding brutal axes and kite shields taller than any man, of towering armored horsemen hefting huge iron lances mounted upon great destriers with burning red eyes, of dark shamans who summoned forth demons of blood and fire to fight alongside the armies of the Norse, of dark, majestic warrior kings of unsurpassed martial might who dwelled within black halls of iron and beheaded and gutted their enemies within their fortresses in praise of the cruel gods they so faithfully worshipped. Indeed, few had faced the war host of the Norsemen and lived to speak of it. Those who had tried were simply butchered violently and left as a sacrifice to the brazen war god of the Northmen. Faced by the extreme opposition of Sigmar Heldenhammer and a united army of several tribes, and still reeling from the loss of High King Varag Skulltaker in battle during the previous year, the NORSCI clans were unable to successfully hold their ground against the southern onslaught. Though the Norsemen fought like maddened bears in the defense of their homesteads, they were eventually forced northwards by the armies of the Unbrogen, Udosies, Tolutans, and Cherusans. Fleeing across the northeastern rivers, the NORSCI were then forced to contend with the fierce Ungol horse tribes, but were able to fight through them to reach the Troll country. There, the Norse sagas record the final stand of the mighty Egil Bloodheart, a giant warrior of great renown and incredible power who held off the advance of the Ungol hordes long enough to allow his kinsmen to flee to the Chaos Wastes. Oral tradition records Egil, proud to the point of insanity, as having severed his own head from his neck to deny the Ungolls the pleasure of killing him. After much hardship, the NORSCI finally returned to Norsca, but instead of the safe refuge they had hoped for, they found their ancestral homeland occupied by many strange and barbarous races. Among these were a race of primeval savages who were kin to the earliest human tribes who had become the original beastmen, as well as the bloodthirsty Kurgan tribes of the eastern steppes. The NORSCI would not be denied, however, and in a ferocious war of conquest they slaughtered or subjugated all the other races of the land until they alone became the dominant force. It was from this war of conquest that the bloodlines of these barbarous people were mingled and a new, even more ferocious nation of warriors was forged. The NORSCANS. The Great Invasion of the NORSII. Though the NORSII had ravaged the lands of their neighbours on countless occasions, one of the most famous was their massive invasion of the Cheruscan and Telutan tribes in the age before the founding of the Empire by SIGMAR HELDENHAMMER. In -7 IC, a horde of bloodthirsty Norsemen, under the leadership of their High King, a mighty Chaos Champion of Khorne, known as Varag Skull-Taker, descended from the frozen north to lay waste and burn all before them as an offering to the gods. The terrible threat of a NORSII invasion drove the formerly rival Cheruscan and Telutan to put aside their differences and join forces against the terrifying threat. Such was the ferocity and power of the NORSII that not even the combined efforts of the two tribes was able to hold them back, and the NORSII succeeded in conquering the Cheruscan and Telutan lands, modern Hochland and Talabakland respectively, pushing out the native tribes and causing them to migrate further and further south in order to escape certain death or enslavement at the brutal axes of the Norse. The Cheruscan and Telutan subsequently appealed to the fierce Teutogan tribe to their south for aid, but even the legendary sons of the White Wolf were fearful of the ferocious Norsemen, and Artur, chieftain of the Teutogans and lord of the Faustschlag, had instead elected to watch events unfold, hoping that the NORSII juggernaut exhausted itself against the Teutogans' rivals in the south, particularly the Unberogans, and leave their lands ripe for conquest by the people of the Faustschlag. The now homeless tribes looked to the far south for support, to the seat of the Unberogan tribe and the mighty King Bjorn. Appealing to the honourable chieftain for aid, and pledging their sword oaths to him if he would assist them, Bjorn agreed to help the beleaguered tribes and marshal the full strength of the Unberogan to war. His decision was also motivated by the knowledge that the NORSII would inevitably turn their axes upon his own lands once the Cheruscan and Telutan were wiped out. King Bjorn's legendary son, Sigmar Heldenhammer, was not part of that great muster, however, having instead been charged to steward Unberogan lands while his father made war in the far north. For weeks uncounted did the armies of the southern kings battle against the terrible hordes of the north. A host of fully 7,000 warriors, outnumbering the NORSII nearly 2-1, marched into the cold lands of their new dominion. In the initial battle, fully 1,000 southern warriors alone had been slaughtered by the NORSII. Hundreds more had been dealt such blows and had been butchered so badly that they would never fight again. NORSCI wolf ships had penetrated far inland, and parties of raiders had managed to assault the Theodosi's tribes and their principal settlement of Hogvik, besieging the seat of King Volfilla of the Theodosi's himself before the southern armies were able to relieve the siege. These battles with the hosts of the southerly kings were merely foreplay, however, each confrontation merely a brief skirmish foreshadowing the true and terrible battle about to begin on the rocky foothills east of the Great Middle Mountains. The warriors of the north were brutal and ferocious beyond all reason. Any single Northman worth easily 3 Southmen in battle. The very savagery and overpowering drive for personal glory that made the NORSCI such phenomenal warriors proved also to be their greatest weakness. For the armies of the NORSCI lacked the methodical discipline and numerical superiority of the southern tribes, which had served to impart a huge advantage to the defenders. 6,000 Southerners gave battle against 4,000 cold-eyed killers from across the Sea of Claws, black-armored champions at the fore with hordes of hulking berserkers at their bearskin-cloaked backs. They charged at their foes, howling bestial prayers to the god Khorne, and promising brutal ends to their foes. Volleys of arrow fire smashed into these madmen, but to no avail. The steel-armored champions, bloody-furred hounds, and howling monstrosities of the northern horde struck into the southerners' lines with a fury born of the love of war, wreaking terrible havoc amongst their ranks and slaying hundreds. A wedge of heavy NORSCI horsemen smashed into the flanks of the Southerners, killing scores with their mighty brazen axes, but these knights were nonetheless defeated by frenzied Cherusan wildmen, who tore the armored giants from the saddle, while unbroken axemen dispatched with brutal strikes. Back and forth the tide of the battle swung, but slowly. The discipline of the Southerners won out, as did their greater numbers. They advanced as a silent block of axes and swords, resolute in their desire to see the offense of the Northmen avenged. A great cheer rose from the combined ranks, as it seemed the Norsemen's fate was sealed. Only for the appearance of their king, resplendent in his red chaos plate and bearing aloft his flaming greatsword, to restore order and courage to the NORSCI ranks. Emboldened, the NORSCI fought in an ordered retreat which drove back the Southern Alliance and won them the day. The Southerners had neither the strength nor manpower to launch a pursuit now, and the NORSCI had retreated to a highly defensible position of a thickly wooded ridgeline and regrouped there in good order. In the end, the Southern army was forced to make a costly charge up the hill to defeat their foes. The Southerners charged, and the NORSCI fought like demons against them, their fury unmatched and their shield walls as impregnable fortresses atop their strong, elevated positions. Many times had unbroken axes and swords failed to splinter the shields of the Norse. It was only by inches that the feral men of the Northlands were driven back, but for each inch a score of Southmen had fallen bloodily and brutishly. Even when they had been driven from the top of the hill, the NORSCI had remained defiant to the last, fighting in smaller and smaller circles and asking for no quarter from the enemy. Varag Skulltaker slew many in the battle, and had even fought the Unberoggan king Bjorn in single combat. Demonic sword met magical axe as the two kings fought, but Bjorn eventually proved too great for the NORSII warlord and hacked the Chaos Champion's head from his shoulders. Enraged by the loss of their king, Varag Skulltaker's dark-armoured Huskarls fell wrathfully upon the Unberoggan king, savagely hacking him to death and tearing his body to bloody ribbons. Despite the massive losses sustained by the Southmen, the NORSII were successfully pushed out of the Cheruscan and Telutan lands. The defeat of the main horde also signalled the withdrawal of the NORSII forces raiding and besieging the lands of the Eudocies. The Flight of the NORSII, -7 IC. With the breaking of the snows, SIGMAR, newly ascended to the position of Unberoggan king, called upon the sword oaths of the Cheruscan and Telutan and journeyed north once more to bring war upon the chosen of the dark gods. He had also entreated the Teutogans for aid, but to no avail, with some tribesmen even going so far as to waylay Sigmar's army as it passed through their territory. Finally arriving in the cold land of the Eudoci, a beleaguered realm that long suffered daily invasions at the hands of the NORSII, Sigmar's warriors lifted the newest NORSII siege of the Eudoci's keep of Zalzenhus. The king of the Eudocis, Wulfila, was then only too happy to join his warriors to Sigmar's army. Thus did the wild-haired, kilted warriors of the Eudoci's tribe finally take the battle to the marauders whom they had been forced to fear for so long. Though the NORSII fought like madmen to protect the steads from their former victims, the battle was never in doubt. With a full 8,000 warriors outnumbering them by several magnitudes, and with no strong leader to unite them with, the death of their high king, the fractious NORSII were forced to retreat further and further back north to the coast of the Sea of Claws, where their wolf ships were anchored. Their villages burned and plundered by the men of the south, there was nothing left for them but to return to the northern wastelands of their birth. Sigmar's war machines had smashed the longships to burning kindling, however, thus robbing the NORSII of their salvation. But Sigmar had foolishly underestimated the NORSII, and though many of their kinsmen had been slain by the massive army of the south, yet more clans were able to fight their way through southern flanks to the then unknown lands of the Kislevite steppes, slaughtering their way through the nomadic Ungol and wandering Kurgan tribes until finally they reached the lands of the Chaos Wastes, Norsca itself. There they scratched a bare living from the bleak land, fighting the neighbouring Kurgan and Ungols to assert dominance in the north, and amongst each other for resources and hunting grounds. Where once the NORSII lived in mighty halls of fire, now they were reduced to dwelling within icy caves and hovels built from the cannibalized ruins of the once proud wolf ships that had carried their warriors to battle for generations. Many were the oaths pre-offered to the brutal gods of the north, as the NORSII swore that they and their descendants would one day cross the Sea of Claws and bring the bloodthirsty songs of war southwards and kill all who dwelt in them. It is recounted in the dread sagas that during the earliest stages of Norsca's settling, that the NORSII came into conflict with a grotesque race of massive, Trent-like beings known as the Tree Blood, who savaged many of the early tribes. In desperation, the NORSII cried out to T'Char, the Changer of Ways, for salvation, and unto his people did the Raven gift the NORSII with the magical fires of chaos to drive the Tree Blood from the land. With axe and flame, the ancient heroes led their kinsmen to slaughter the Tree Blood and conquered all of Norsca for their own, building their oldest halls from the husks of the creatures. So complete was the NORSII's annihilation of the Tree Blood that only one remained, the greatest and most hate-filled of its kind, the Troll Tree. This horrific remnant of an ancient age was finally felled by the legendary Chaos Champion Wulfric the Wanderer, and from its bark was created the second Sea Fang, the first having been lost in an incursion to Ulthuan, the largest and greatest of all Norse longships. CORMAC BLOODAXE'S Vengeance in 9 IC. These are days of great power. The tribes of the north, the beasts of the forest, and a great prince of Karnath will fall upon Middenheim, and we will baptize this world in blood. From Kar Odaken, a shaman of the NORSII, foretelling the coming of King CORMAC BLOODAXE. The NORSII, driven to the lands beyond the Sea of Claws, were left to recoup their strength and organize themselves into new factions, many clans having been wiped out or thinned by SIGMAR's invasion. During this time, many grand heroes rose up to lead the NORSII, such as the legendary hero Ekil Bloodheart, who fought the Ungol hordes on the border of the Chaos Wastes. Despite the many great heroes of this era, few are so renowned in the early annals of the Northmen as CORMAC BLOODAXE, a warrior whose name that bespoke the naked ferocity and bloody-minded courage of this warrior race. A visionary warrior king, the son of the slain NORSII High King Varag Skulltaker, who had fallen in combat against King Bjorn of the Unberogen. Cormac's incredible strength and ravenous drive for vengeance saw him arise to claim leadership of his father's tribes, the Iron Wolves, and eventually claim kingship over all the NORSII tribes after a series of battles waged against the Fiend Jarls. His advisor was the ancient shaman Kar Odaken, an emissary of the Chaos Gods themselves, who had long watched over the chosen people of the Dark Gods and had guided their destiny by long serving as a vicegerent and counselor to the warrior kings of the North, including Cormac's father and grandfather. It was Kar Odaken who had forged Cormac's mighty demon axe, binding a creature of Khorne to the blackened blade. Ensorcelled axe in hand, Cormac wrought unholy havoc on countless battlefields. The NORSII invasion broke out in 9 IC, barely 2 decades after their exile at Sigmar's hand had the cruel Northmen returned to repay the Emperor for their suffering. United into the mighty juggernaut that had once made the world tremble, they sailed out from their fastnesses in the subarctic lands of the north, their only desire to avenge the deaths of their sword brothers and kinsmen those many years ago. They had begun their campaign of reconquest and revenge by raiding the holdings of the Northern Ropsmen tribe, who alone had taken the NORSI's abandoned territory after Sigmar's war in the north, largely due to the fact that no one else had wanted it. Such was the terror the memory of the NORSI evoked that even despite their exile, the marks of their dark worship and barbaric culture were still carved deep in the northern lands, and so few tribes of the south had deigned to claim such holdings, believing them cursed and haunted by the spectres of the raiders' many victims. The Ropsmen's courage proved their undoing. For so exposed to the sea of claws as they were, they could not withstand the ferocity of the NORSI raids, which plundered their villages and took their wives and elders as hostages. The NORSI thus held them as ransom, and extracted from the defeated Ropsmen chieftains their oath for a season's worth of service, thereby enslaving the northern tribe to their will. Next, the NORSI fell upon the Eudoses tribe, their long-time rivals. The Seawolves attacked the northern capital city of Hogvik, many miles inland from the shore of the Sea of Claws, and put it to the torch. Joined by the forces of their Ropsmen allies, the NORSI easily slaughtered the defenders. It was King CORMAC, resplendent in the ancient chaos plate of his father and wielding his flaming demon axe, who slew the mightiest warrior amongst the Eudoses, Siphael, with a single strike that split the brave clansman in two, from neck to groin. King Wulfhere had all but thrown open the gates of his castle of Zelsenhus when CORMAC slit the throat of his wife, who was heavy with child. The NORSI then dragged the king out of his hall and crucified him, and threw the still living members of his family to burn alive upon a pyre. Cormac Bloodaxe would later reflect upon this and say that no man so weak and soft should have been made a leader of men. All the Eudoses who live within Hogvik were slaughtered, the warriors slain in honorable battle, their non-combatants impaled upon great brazen stakes in honor of corn, and the settlement's children sacrificed upon bloody altars for the glory of the Lord of Skulls. With Wulfire's death, the Eudoses quickly fell into the vicious clannish bickering for which they were so famed, as a succession crisis quickly spiraled out of control as the chieftains fought to take the now vacant throne. With the defense of the north shattered, the NORSI were able to freely move further inland and wreak havoc and destruction upon the southern tribes, just as they had done in the ancient days before Sigmar's rise to power. With every victory, the tragic accounts of the NORSI's atrocities and savagery spread like wildfire throughout the empire, sapping the courage and resolve of its defenders with every retelling, as more and more refugees carried terrible accounts of the brutality they had suffered at the hands of the Northmen. Horrifying accounts of the oceans of blood their axes had spilled, and the countless innocents carried off into slavery in the bowels of their dreaded wolfships. These barbarous attacks were not the work of a mere horde of raging barbarians, however, but were in fact calculated specifically at weakening the morale of the Empire's army, as well as being specifically formulated in order to harm the ability of the Empire to quickly react and raise more troops to confront the NORSCI invasion. This was only exacerbated by the fact that when SIGMAR learned of the NORSCI invasion and the Ropsmen's complicity in it, he marshalled his forces and waged a long, arduous campaign to crush them and drive them out of the Empire, for they had forfeited their place in it by aiding the savage Norsemen. This left the inner lands of the Empire undefended against the wrath of the Northmen. The Ropsmen tribe was all but annihilated by SIGMAR, their tattered remnants driven into the then unknown lands of the northeast, where they would come into conflict with the Ungolls. Nonetheless, this planted the seeds of dissension and disunity within the Empire, for the violence perpetrated against the Ropsmen, seen by some as victims of the NORSII, was quite controversial in Sigmar's time. As a result, the counts became wary around their emperor, fearing what would become of their lands should they ever voice a contrary opinion. The purity of Sigmar's justice, long seen as the epitome of good governance by the tribes, was now cast into doubt. Despite this disunity, the Empire was able to raise an army to meet the NORSI invaders. Though were it not for the Theodosies in the north setting aside their civil war over their succession crisis, elevating the canny warrior Con Carsten to the position of war chief, the NORSI likely would have succeeded in conquering the whole of the Empire long before Sigmar Unbrogen could have marshalled the tribal levies to stand against the Horde. Indeed, but for the vigorous hit-and-run raids and tireless guerrilla warfare perpetrated by the Theodosies upon the NORSI juggernaut, the entirety of the North would have most assuredly fallen long before Sigmar and his allies could have mustered to oppose them. When Sigmar finally faced the Northmen, they had done what no other enemy had accomplished ever before or since. They, and they alone, had managed to lay low the God King in true battle. Indeed, the Imperial army, resplendent in its power and its morale, bolstered by the mythical presence of the Emperor, had expected to defeat the warriors of the North in a single, decisive battle. As such, it was completely and totally unprepared for the tactics employed by the Norsemen. The Imperials had expected undisciplined berserkers, only to find the natural ferocity of the NORSI tempered by a razor-sharp military precision. The NORSI had given battle in imitation of the southern armies, marching in tightly packed ranks with a hitherto unheard-of cohesion, and yet still retaining the unabashed fury and incredible martial skill that made the men of the North masters of the battlefield. A perfect synthesis of military discipline and wild ferocity. Even the whirlwind fury of the Thuringian warrior bands was little compared to the merciless berserker rage of the NORSI warriors, who met the Thuringian vanguard of Sigmar's army and hacked them apart, almost managing to slay their Count Otwin the Berserker. The axes and swords of the Norse were not the only foe Sigmar faced that day, for the NORSI had also received a pledge of loyalty from the Kurgan and Hung tribes, and so did the plainsmen of the East swear their lives to the service of CORMAC BLOODAXE. The horse clans of the Kul, Mung, Khazag, Hong, and many others did encircle Sigmar's host, hammering the Imperials with arrows, holding them in place while the Norsemen's heavy cavalry charged their lines, smashing into the southern warriors like the fist of the blood god himself. The armies of the Emperor were completely and utterly routed, and had they not organized enough to mount an orderly withdrawal from the battlefield, they would have surely all been annihilated. Sigmar had realized that having sustained such losses, the NORSCI could not be defeated now upon the open field of battle. The only recourse remaining, therefore, was to retreat to the Teutoburger fortress of Middenheim, renowned in legend as having never once been conquered. The great lifts that allow passages to the city in the modern era had not been created in the time of Sigmar, and so to gain passage into the city would have required the NORSCI to simultaneously take and hold both the eastern and western passages, as well as the viaduct of the city. It was only by drawing the NORSCI into such a siege that there would be any hope of the Empire surviving CORMAC BLOODAXE'S invasion. The NORSCI had followed the fleeing Imperials to the fastness of Ulrich, their number bolstered by hordes of raging beastkin. Gathered as an endless tide of sinew and steel below the Faustschlag, the Norsemen brought the halves of their mighty axes banging against the round bosses of their shield as they bellowed and roared the black names of the dark gods and their honored ancestors, while the beastmen screeched and roared in blasphemous hymns to those self-same deities. It was a droning noise that shuddered the courage of all who heard it, a terrible sound that spoke of the need and desire to make war for no reason other than the suffering it would cause. Here, clearly demonstrated, was the reason Sigmar was forced to drive the Norsemen from his empire. For where the men of the Reich sought peace and plenty, the Norsemen craved for battle and war. Where development and progress were the watchwords of the Empire, the joy of killing and the lust for domination drove the grim warriors of the savage North. Where the gods of the South rewarded worship with peace and protection, the baleful gods of the Norsemen demanded worship and offered naught but war and the power to carry it on in return. The siege was brutal, lasting for 13 full days and nights. Merciless NORSCI charges were thrown back, but with the greatest of effort, with each attack seeing the NORSCI reaping a terrible toll from their adversaries. For where the men of Sigmar's empire fought with all they had for the sake of bare survival, the men of the North fought with the savage desire that their gods would notice their might and reward them for their bravery. Marshalled before baleful war altars dedicated to their gods, the NORSCI truly felt the eyes of the gods upon them, and the raging energies of the warp surged upon them, transmuting them into new, deadlier forms. On the 13th, most terrible day of the siege, CORMAC BLOODAXE, who had slain so many in battle that his axe now perpetually ran thick with congealed blood, awoke knowing the will of his god was to be carried out. For his vision seethed red, as though his eyes were drenched perpetually in blood. Before a great pit, where the NORSCI had thrown the corpses of their enemies in honor of Khorne, there did Cormac command the greatest warriors of 8 clans to sacrifice themselves to Khorne's glory. Mightily pleased with their valour and tithe, Khorne did take up the NORSII king and reforged him into a manifestation of rage, a demon prince. Cormac, in his new, resplendent form, is said to have strode forth and broken apart the walls of Middenheim with a single blow, slaughtering hundreds with sweeps of his burning axe, while his very presence drove the men of the Empire mad with rage born of fear. The Norsemen roared their exultation to the cold thrones of the gods, their cries now even more hideously animalistic than those of the beast kin who stood alongside them, and they fought with fury so redoubled that none could withstand them. Such was their joy to fight under the gaze of a living avatar of Khorne the Mighty. Soon the demon prince crossed blades with SIGMAR, the 2 kings fighting to decide the fate of their peoples. It was only through the aid of Mercer, warrior eternal of the Faustschlag, and the divine power of Ulrich himself, that SIGMAR was able to marshal enough strength to defeat Cormac BLOODAXE, banishing the fallen king to the realm of chaos. With the banishment of Cormac, the morale of the NORSII army gave out, and they now fought their way past the vengeful press of Imperials to reach their wolfships and return to their new homeland. Though the Empire was ultimately victorious, the dreadful memory of how close it had come to desolation loomed long in the memories of all who had fought and suffered in the invasion, and few would ever forget the terror of the mighty Norsemen. Once more, the NORSII were thrown back across the Sea of Claws to the land now known as Norsca. In the aftermath of the Middenheim invasion, SIGMAR had marshalled what remained of his forces and led his warriors in a series of revenge raids against the NORSII homeland of Norsca. He succeeded in slaying numerous tribes and had razed dozens of villages along the southernmost coast. But the terrain and the lack of numbers meant he could not penetrate further inland and take the fight to the more numerous tribes dwelling in the land's interior. The NORSII were thus largely left to their own devices, allowed to recoup their strength and prepare themselves for later conflicts with the Empire.